Welcome to Learning Thursdays. I'm Dean Hale with the OASAS Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. Today's two-part presentation is titled Deaf Culture and Deaf and Hard of Hearing Individuals with Substance Use Disorder. And joining me today are Susan Demers and Kevin Poor of the Substance and Addiction Intervention Services for the Deaf. They'll be joining me in just a moment, but first, a word about Learning Thursdays. Learning Thursdays are offered to behavioral health professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge and skills of the New York State substance use disorder workforce as we strive to improve the lives of individuals needing prevention, treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services. A goal of Learning Thursdays is to support the professional development of the treatment, prevention, recovery, and harm reduction workforce. We do this by offering regular presentations that are relevant to today's substance use disorder treatment professional. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to contact us at the Learning Thursdays mailbox. You can use the same mailbox to express an interest in providing a future Learning Thursdays program. And now it's time to start the presentation and welcome our guests.
Hi there. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Susan Demers. I'm here from SAISD, Substance and Addiction Intervention Services for the Deaf at NTID.
Hi there. Happy to follow Susan. My name is Kevin Poor, and I'm also from SAISD. We're excited today to talk to you about some of the services that we provide. Hopefully it is well received.
As far as our roles go, I'm a counselor, and Kevin?
I'm the director of the Office of SAISD. SAISD was started in 1989. We offer a variety of services here on campus. Our office operates under the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Supports as a preventative program. We provide education services and counseling services on drug and alcohol intervention and prevention. We also often do referrals to other medical providers as needed. We provide services here at NTID, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, but we also provide services off campus at schools, agencies, and other sites. We're contracted to provide services at the John L. Norris Addiction Treatment Center when deaf patients need our support. And we have that contract to support their patients. That accounts for about 20 hours a week.
Our team here is fluent in American Sign Language. In this way, we are able to meet the cultural and linguistic needs of the students on campus and the community at large.
The next bullet here, we do provide drug and alcohol screening to assess a student's need for additional services. We have a strong focus on advocacy in our office. We advocate for accessibility, which you can understand is very important to us. Should anyone have concerns related to addictive behaviors, we offer opportunities to discuss those issues with us. We don't provide one-on-one therapeutic counseling. That is handled by a different office. Next slide, please.
On this next slide, we'll play a video that is an old TV ad featuring deaf actors. You might think, why are they showing us an old Pepsi ad? Kevin?
Yeah, today we'll be talking about deaf culture and how to work with deaf and hard of hearing patients in the clinical setting. But let's start on a lighter note. Here's this ad from 2008. So it's a little bit dated, but I think it's still relevant to the issues that deaf people experience today.
This ad will demonstrate behaviors that are heavily rooted in deaf culture and ubiquitous in the deaf community, which we'll expand upon as we go forward. These are the following topics we will discuss today. We'll talk about deaf and hard of hearing consumer experiences, the differences between the medical model and the cultural model, deaf history, deaf culture, ASL. We'll touch on those topics. We'll also get into oppression, barriers that are experienced by the deaf community, and the diversity that is found within the deaf population. We are not a homogeneous community, as you might expect. We will discuss our personal experiences today and knowledge as deaf people, and hope that you understand that not all deaf people you meet will be exactly like us. We've got part 1 and 2 of this training in which we have tried to condense a long, rich history of deaf experiences into just 4 hours, so keep in mind that we are just scratching the surface here today.
Based on our lived experience as deaf people and our experience as clinicians for the deaf, we're witness to the consequence of ignorance and of unintentional oppression and marginalization of deaf and hard of hearing people. There are people who have not encountered deaf or hard of hearing people in their clinical site, and we want to offer more information about how to interact with those patients. Part of our task today is to clear up some frequent misconceptions. Hopefully you'll understand more about how to interact with these people in your medical facilities. And we'll talk about why it is important to handle them with a soft touch. There are common misconceptions that people make when they meet a deaf person. They often think that just because they can speak clearly, they must be able to hear, which is not always the case. For simplicity, the term deaf today is going to include several identities: deaf, hard of hearing, late deafened, deaf blind, and deaf disabled, unless we specifically mention a specific community. Here's a few statistics about what the deaf community experiences when it comes to substance use disorders. There are only 4 recognized residential treatment facilities that provide services in American Sign Language in the country. Options are quite limited for deaf people who need treatment. Often they have to either travel out of state or work through an interpreter. Self-help meetings like AA or NA often aren't accessible to ASL users. Deaf and hard of hearing people experience barriers throughout their lives, and they're often overlooked. They're at a higher risk of untreated substance use disorders specifically because of these barriers.
Additionally, research is quite limited in this area. We do hope that the amount of research that's done in the future increases in order to meet the needs of our population.
Maybe you're unfamiliar with this community. I would say at least as many deaf people have a substance use disorder as do hearing people. And the data proves that. I suspect because of these barriers, that relative percent is actually greater.
Oftentimes, there are more consequences when it comes to substance use disorders. For deaf people, they're experiencing more severe consequences. Now we'll move into talking about the medical view and the way that medical systems view deaf people. In society, we have expectations and norms, and deaf people are expected to reach this level of normality or assimilation. Meaning that when a deaf person is born, they aren't given access in sign language. They're forced to lip read, and their parents are even dissuaded from using sign language. This is the medical model. This is the reality of it. An example of assimilation, or I guess parallels that can be found in assimilation, harken back to native populations. When they lived here and European colonizers invaded the land and forced them to change their clothing, to change their language, to change their culture, to fit into a Eurocentric model. This experience is not exactly what deaf people are experiencing in the US, but we can draw parallels to what was forced assimilation during that time and upon marginalized populations. I can share a personal experience of when I gave birth to my daughter. She was taken for the newborn hearing screening, as is conventional. The audiologist and the nurse came back into the room and said, "We have great news. Your daughter is perfectly normal," meaning she was hearing. I was shocked and I was offended by their statement. I just wanted a healthy baby. I didn't care if she was deaf or hearing. I just wanted her to be healthy. And I told the nurse that the approach in telling me those results in that way was shocking and inappropriate. As a deaf mother, I was offended at the way the news was relayed, and I asked them to rephrase it. In doing so, they changed their statement to, "Your daughter's hearing level is within the normal range." And again, this is just an example of the viewpoint that the medical systems have on deaf people, that we are not normal, and perfectly normal is hearing. The medical viewpoint prioritizes speech and hearing, believing that speech is superior to signing. Doctors encourage cochlear implant surgeries and the use of hearing aids and specialized speech therapy services. Our hope is that medical facilities would offer options that include ASL as modes of communication. For folks who have just given birth to a deaf baby, they need to be introduced to deaf culture. Typically, hearing parents are meeting a deaf person for the first time when it's their deaf child. So it's our belief that the medical professionals need to be the ones to provide these options for new parents.
Right. As the only deaf person in my hearing family, I can relate to these models. At 18 months old, I got sick and I lost my hearing. My family told me much later that the doctors suggested I should have a tonsillectomy to see if that would help improve my deafness. They were proposing surgery for an 18-month-old kid. Somehow, having my tonsils removed didn't fix my deafness, right? I'm still deaf to this day. I didn't need to be fixed, but at 18 months old, I didn't know any better.
Again, the medical model assumes that deafness is something that needs to be fixed. It's broken and needs to be fixed. And again, this word deafness, we prefer in our communities to use just deaf. In our culture, deafness speaks towards the medical model more so than the cultural model. I do want to give a trigger warning on this slide. These are photos of cochlear implant surgeries and hearing aids, as well as other devices like the Baha device that you can see in the lower right corner. These are listening aid devices. This is just to exemplify different ways that people choose to listen and use their residual hearing. Some of these devices do require surgery, and cochlear implant surgery is not a one-and-done surgery. It requires a lot of therapy, additional training, and it costs a lot of money as well. These children also have to attend speech therapy, which could potentially pull them out of their core classes at school to practice speech and hearing.
I will say that whether you have a assisted listening device or not, it doesn't measure whether you are deaf or a part of our community. There's a large sense of solidarity and camaraderie in the community. And we try not to split ourselves up among the community. We value our time together.
We can go on to the next slide, which will lead us into reframing our views. We will now move into talking about the cultural model and the cultural view of the deaf community. As you can see here, we have listed deaf identity, deaf gain, cultural norms and values, American Sign Language, community, poetry, art, and shared experiences. The deaf community has so many beautiful pieces of art done by folks from our very own community. Additionally, cultures are required to have 4 components in order to be a bona fide culture. They consist of language, behavioral norms, values, and traditions. All of these components can be found within the deaf community and deaf culture. We value shared experiences to create closer relationships amongst other community members. We tend to share information with each other very quickly. For example, if there was a car dealership that had a signing salesperson, we would tell our friends, or if we got a discount at this place or the other place, at the hairdresser who was deaf-friendly, we tend to share this information and allow our community to feel more comfortable by way of sharing experiences where we had a positive time interacting with a hearing employee. Oh, also deaf culture has norms and traditions in the way of sporting events. We gather nationally and internationally for different sporting events like bowling, Olympics, baseball, cornhole, different types of events that we gather together and socialize at.
Yeah, there's that camaraderie I mentioned before. We really value our time together, so any reason to congregate is a good one.
Here you can see a drawing of being born deaf. And this situation is maybe the opposite of my experience with my daughter being born hearing, and then other people who have deaf children, on the other hand, will get this news. I'm so sorry your child is deaf, and it's given in such a negative way, and it causes parents to feel grief over this negative emotion that the doctors are portraying. But again, they've failed, quote unquote, their first test.
Right. In this cartoon, the deaf parents have a child who is deaf, and they're thrilled. They're high-fiving. The pathological model, right, as Susan mentioned that she experienced, is that even at 3 hours old, this child has already failed a test. Their life has only just begun and they're labeled a failure, right? This is another example of the oppressive idea that there's something wrong with deaf people, which is clearly not shared by the parents of this child, who are thrilled to have somebody who's like them.
When deaf parents have deaf children, we see it as a positive outcome. There's no fear of deafness. There's no apologizing. Everything is fine and great. They're deaf like us. And we can go on to the next slide here. Here are some statistics to share with you about deaf culture. I am in the 10% of deaf people who learn culture, language, and norms from their family, having deaf family members. On my mother's side, her whole family was hearing, and so she experienced language deprivation, oppression, and her side of the family would not let anyone use sign language. She was forced to lip read, and people around her spoke. On my father's side, he had a different experience. And then when I came along, I had ASL fully in use in my home. But this is not the experience of 90% of deaf children. Typically, hearing parents of deaf children do not learn sign. And again, like we discussed in the medical model, doctors are not encouraging deaf people to learn sign because they state it will impair their ability to learn how to read and write in English. But as we all know, there is a critical window for learning language. This is from the age of 0 to 5. From birth to 5 years old, this critical window of language acquisition, if missed, makes it difficult to acquire other languages. And during this time, the parents are at fault for not learning sign language and not providing access to communication for their children.
It has to be stressed that the deaf experience is not homogeneous. There are no two experiences that are alike. I became deaf at 18 months, but I didn't have access to sign language until I was in a mixed hearing and deaf classroom at about 10. My sign language skills started to increase in 5th or 6th grade. Unfortunately, many deaf people miss out on this early stage of language development, and it really has lifelong consequences. Even deaf adults with fluent ASL skills may not have competent English literacy.
Yes, there is some variation. And if I can mention incidental learning and the lack of moments for incidental learning, missing information as a deaf person, including myself, we are missing audiological information that is being played over, let's say, the radio. For example, my daughter and I were riding in the car, and I didn't know that the radio was on. And all of a sudden, she taps me and said, "Mom, I want to go buy a shirt at Old Navy." I thought, well, that was out of the blue, and that was very random to think of right now. We're not even near Old Navy. Little did I know, she tells me that there was a radio ad for Old Navy tank tops for $5. And I'm missing out on this information because it's broadcast through sound waves.
Right.
And so again, 90% of deaf people are born to hearing parents, meaning that deaf culture is often passed peer to peer rather than parent to child. As you might think, traditionally, culture is passed down. Deaf folks are getting their language and culture and learning about norms and traditions through their peers. Again, in this traditional sense, culture is typically passed from parent to child. But deaf folks who do not have other deaf people in their family are not getting this transition of culture and language and norms, as in maybe American family style cultural traditions are passed down from parent to child, as well as in other countries.
ASL is a visual language, so in an all-deaf school where everyone is a signer, that incidental learning happens naturally. I can see somebody talking about the baseball game while I'm eating my lunch.
Exactly. At deaf schools, potentially deaf kids have access to everything that's going on compared to public schools or mainstreamed environments in mixed hearing and deaf classrooms. Maybe we want to talk about what mainstream means. It could mean a deaf child is placed into a majority hearing classroom, and so they're expected to learn through the use of an interpreter, potentially with the addition of a note taker, and that instruction is not direct instruction. Whereas in deaf schools, deaf children are learning directly from deaf teachers and signing staff, so they have direct communication with all of those adults in their environment. All right, now we have our pop quiz. Which of these is considered rude by deaf people? A, B, C, or D? What do you think?
Well,
Maybe more than one right answer, but what about staring in the direction of a sign conversation?
yeah, that is totally annoying. If I'm out at a restaurant and someone's giving me this look of shock, it's one thing if it's a child, I guess. That can be helped, but another adult, I don't know if they know sign language and they're trying to eavesdrop, or they don't know and they're just staring, but I think that one is rude.
Right. Staring is not historically comfortable for us, but maybe someone's learning sign language. It still can be considered a bit rude, and if it does seem like they're eavesdropping, that does make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Deaf people don't consider this rude if we're talking about someone and say, hey, M on the chest, remember that person?
Oh, M? Who do you mean?
I mean Mary. Do you remember?
Mary, what does she look like?
Mary has brown hair, about shoulder-length hair, has tattoos on her arm, and has broad shoulders.
Yeah, right, I know her.
And so that quick example was a way that we typically describe someone to jog our memory. We'll use characteristic or distinctive markers on that person to describe who they are to jog the memory of the person we're trying to chat with.
Right. These characteristics change over time. Change in popular culture means that tattoos are a lot more common than they were. Facial jewelry is also pretty popular and a helpful descriptive characteristic. So some of the details may have changed, but if you're being respectful, I think it's fine.
This is very typical to describe what someone looks like. Again, when you've forgotten the name or don't know the name, if you can elucidate the details of what they look like, that typically helps us continue on in our conversation. So maybe you will be meeting with a client and they'll ask about, oh, do you remember the blonde counselor that was here last week? These are typical descriptors that you might run into when you're working with deaf clients. Otherwise, we have some other answers here. If you know sign and then you don't say anything, and let's say you're in an elevator and you see people signing and you know sign language, it's important to let people know that you're aware of what they're saying. If you hold back, that is considered to be rude.
Yeah, if there are two hearing signers in a room in mixed company with deaf people, they should be using sign language so that the deaf person has the option of joining that conversation, or just so they can stay aware of what's happening in the room. I think that's a basic mutual respect.
Of course, not leaving someone out, especially if you do know a common language. If you're able to sign and be inclusive of everyone in the environment, that is much preferred. At colleges and universities that have deaf students on campus, there are sometimes different signs or flyers posted about policies that everyone in the environment is expected to use sign language. Now we can dive into the rich history of the deaf community. We'll start off with Martha's Vineyard. Maybe some of you know about Martha's Vineyard Island in New England. In this community on Chilmark, Martha's Vineyard Island, there were many people who knew sign language there from around 1640 to the 1800s. Hearing and deaf people both knew sign language and communicated in this way. Until 1817, when the American School for the Deaf was founded, many of the children from Chilmark went to school there, leaving the island community a bit smaller. American School for the Deaf was the first deaf school in the United States, again founded in 1817. And now in New York State, there are around 10 deaf schools. Gallaudet University was founded in 1864. It's the only liberal arts deaf college for students. And they're able to receive direct communication from all the professors who do sign there. The professors here at NTID, which was founded in 1968, also sign. We will touch on some other time points in deaf history as we go through our presentation today.
I went to Gallaudet for the first 2 years of my undergraduate degree, and I went back there for grad school. And I can remember there was a culture shock. I really had to look at my identity and figure out who I was. I was finally a normal college student. I could play sports, join clubs without any language barriers. Many people who graduate from Gallaudet, they stay in that environment. They stay in the area. They work in Maryland or Virginia or DC because of that thriving deaf community. NTID also has a significant deaf community. It's the largest per capita in the US, in fact. So students at NTID also tend to stay in the community, and which means our deaf community numbers grow.
College for deaf people is typically where they're finding their identity, along with their hearing peers. But if a deaf person was born to a hearing family and never socialized with other deaf folks until they arrived at college, of course this would be a huge culture shock. If their parents didn't learn sign language and they were exposed to sign language for the first time at college, again, this could be very different and shocking to them. Potentially, deaf children who have gone to deaf schools will not experience this culture shock, but every deaf person has their own journey on finding their identity.
Absolutely. It is a huge range of experience.
Huge range, and it takes some people longer to develop their deaf identities, and some have it formed right at birth. Others find it later in life, and others are, finding it along the way.
You see often a lot of deaf people develop some resentment towards their parents because they didn't have the exposure to the deaf community or sign language that some of their peers did. And that sometimes comes up in counseling sessions.
Yes, you may notice some mental health issues related to deafness, identity, historical treatment, and so on. We want to call attention to this conference that took place in Milan, Italy, in 1880. It was the ICED Conference, International Congress on the Education of the Deaf. It was hosted to decide the educational method of instruction for deaf children. Before this ICED conference, deaf children were instructed in sign language at deaf schools by deaf teachers. At this conference, a vote was enacted to do away with sign language as the mode of communication in classrooms. Most of the delegates were hearing, of course, and they decided to ban sign language from the curriculum for deaf students and deaf schools. They decided this was the best way. The best way would be to use spoken language. All of the delegates were then sent home to their respective countries, including one deaf delegate. Subsequently, all of the deaf schools in the U.S. and in other countries fired their deaf teachers and moved over to a spoken language method or an oral method. Students would be punished Rapping of the knuckles would occur when students were caught signing. Sign language was banned from schools, and children were being physically punished. So it was difficult to attend school at this time because they couldn't communicate, and hearing people thought they knew what was best for deaf children, but they don't.
Absolutely. I mean, only one of these 164 voting members were actually a deaf person. So that adage, nothing for us without us, it's just not there. There has been a big shift since, but in this period of history, the enormous lack of opportunities for deaf people still has a legacy today. We've made some improvements in access and other things, but it's by no means perfect.
These experiences have contributed to generational traumas that can still be felt to this moment in time. We'll go on to the next slide. We have a piece of deaf art. This was created in relation to the ICED conference, and you can see them shooting down ASL. You can see it starting to crumble and fall, denoting that the language of instruction was no longer going to be ASL and that oppression of ASL was happening, and the people of the time were saddened and upset about it.
A lot of art pieces created by deaf people work in similar themes of linguistic and cultural oppression, so that is pretty common.
That is very true. So many works of art, beautiful, fantastic works of art done by deaf community members, share similar themes. And this is just one example of that. I wish I could show you so many more because there are so many wonderful pieces of art. But again, this short training only allows for me to show you a few. Another important time point in deaf history is the legitimization of ASL, done by a man named William Stokey. Some of you may recognize this last name if you live in the Rochester area. The last name Stokey is like Stokey Farms, which is right near RIT. This man, William Stokey, has relation to the folks who own the farm. He's a hearing man who researched and identified ASL as a bona fide language, although deaf people already knew that and had been using ASL as a language for many years prior to this point in time, as well as other countries using their own sign languages. ASL is not an international sign language. There are other countries, again, that have their own sign languages. French, Italian sign language. Germany has their own sign language. Of course, here in America, we use ASL, American Sign Language. William Stokey researched and proved that ASL had grammar and syntax and other rules that applied to spoken languages. He was able to legitimize ASL and publish a paper proving that ASL was a bona fide, fully formed language in the 1960s. This legitimization opened up the opportunities for universities and educational systems to provide education in ASL.
Yeah, I remember when I transferred from Gallaudet to the University of Minnesota, one of my core requirements was for a foreign language course. Instead of German or another spoken language, I took the ASL Communication Proficiency Interview, which back then was called the ACPI. And because ASL now had this official designation, they waived my language requirements in 1985 and 86 because of William Stokey's work. There are some places who are still a bit behind on this, but hopefully the understanding that ASL is a full and complete language becomes universal.
Also here we have an ABC alphabet fingerspelling chart. You can see the different shapes of the hands that we use to denote language. We show other things like snow. With these classifiers, we can show the thickness or thinness of an object. We have amazing ways in ASL to describe physical characteristics of items or objects in our environment. And again, these are called classifiers. They're not specifically signs, but used to describe objects.
As Susan said, the hand shape C, making a C with your hand, it's not just a letter. It's used to convey a staggering amount of different concepts. The same is true for many of these hand shapes.
Again, the C can be used to denote a thick jacket that you're wearing. Of course, you would have to enroll yourself in a full ASL language class to understand what we are talking about with these classifiers in full. I do want to note that ASL is not a written language. We don't have a written form.
Do keep in mind as well, ASL is not just the manual alphabet. Fingerspelling, these hand shapes, is only one part of a rich lexicon. So when someone says they know ASL, but all they can do is fingerspell, they only know one piece of that bigger picture, right? Fingerspelling is English-based, and so a sequence of spelled words doesn't evoke a complete concept. You need the rest of the full language that is American Sign Language for that.
As well as facial expressions. Don't forget those non-manual signals that are a feature of ASL. You can't make the wrong face when you're signing happy. You have to match your facial expression with the sign that you are producing and the concept and feeling you're trying to evoke.
ASL is such an expressive language. Expressions on the face, body positioning can often be misconstrued by hearing people. They think that we're angry or mentally unwell when they see us bang on a table and make a dramatic facial expression. This is just a natural part of deaf culture. There's a linguistic meaning that is being overlooked. Someone looks animated for emphasis, and that can be mistaken as anger, right? Assumptions are made and people call the police, which is unfortunate. I have seen that happen from time to time.
Yes, facial expressions can be misconstrued, but they are a vital part of our language and they provide semantic meaning. Our next time point in deaf history is in 1988. There was a Deaf President Now rally at Gallaudet University. Again, they're the only deaf liberal arts college in the country, and they had never had a deaf president up until this time. There were 3 candidates running for presidency, and the committee chose a hearing person. The staff and the students were outraged and had had enough at this point. They decided that it was time for a deaf president. And even though there was an applicant who was fully qualified, the committee chose a hearing person over him for almost no reason. It doesn't make sense for a man to be the president of a women's college. It didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense now. Of course, having a deaf president of a deaf university would make perfect sense. So, in order to prove this point, the students and staff hosted a rally and proved that deaf people are capable of holding positions of presidency.
Right. The president that the Board of Trustees selected had no concept of deaf language. She was not an ASL user, and so in some ways was unique disappointment, was worse than the previous appointees. We were almost moving backwards, and the community had enough. It was a shock to the community that spurred on a week of protest.
This was a major time point on the timeline of deaf history. Identified language and a deaf president at our deaf college. You'll see these progressions as we go through our presentation today. Of course, this picture speaks for itself. Sign language is a human right. It's not an option. It's not allowing other people to decide what's right for you. Every person has a right to learn ASL. It's a natural language for deaf people. ASL or any other sign language, of course. Giving people open access to these options, to communication access, and to communication.
It's just like when another spoken language is banned. Suddenly, you're not allowed to speak your native tongue anymore. Everyone should have a right to express themselves, regardless of the mode that they use. Deaf art often plays on this theme. You'll see the ruler wrapping the knuckles, or hands tied together, or hands cut off at the wrist. This is iconicity of linguistic oppression. It's like, why is this still a discussion? It's a settled issue, but for the deaf community, it's not. Deaf children are born to hearing parents every day who get medicalized advice about deafness from doctors and audiologists. There's no connection with the greater deaf community, and these linguistic decisions are made for the child by their parents based on that limited advice. The best way to express yourself is in the way that works best for you, but unfortunately, that language is wholly deprived. This child can't speak, can't hear. By the time they're 4 or 5, they've already missed a lot of the potential early exposure to a visual language, and that's their human right.
Babies are able to learn signs at 4, 5, 6 months. You can sign the word milk before you're able to produce it in a spoken language. Babies can acquire sign language first. There's baby words, milk and other things, other words that babies need to communicate about that are easy to learn.
Right. There's no small number of baby sign language classes for hearing children and their parents, right? This is so that the child can express their basic needs before they learn how to speak.
On this next slide here, we have 2 pieces of art created by another deaf artist, a wonderful deaf man named Chuck Baird. You can see that he uses hand shapes within the pictures. For example, the cat on the left over here, you can see that it is a picture of a cat with the hand shape of the sign for cat. And then also we have alligator with the sign for alligator depicted here as well. Chuck Baird does such beautiful work and creates art pieces exemplifying animals and signs and oppression of language. There are some positive aspects being shown through deaf art and deaf artwork. There are common deaf cultural themes that deaf artists choose to represent through their artwork.
It's easy to miss, but the sign for alligator is reflected in the water in this painting. So you get both the animal and the ASL sign for it. Many ASL signs are connected to what that concept looks like. Though some aren't, right? Maybe a long time ago, a hearing person came up with it. Often it is iconic. The signs for man and woman appear on the face. Dad, boy, grandfather, man start or all happen above the nose, whereas female, woman, girl are signed on the lower half of the face. Though not as visually accurate, these have become accepted over time.
Yes, we do adhere to these grammatical rules and function of the language. We can go on to our next slide. That's another pop quiz.
Let's say you're walking down the hall and you see 2 deaf people conversing with each other in your path. How do you proceed? You walk up to them, you're not sure what to do. Which option do you take without interrupting their conversation?
What do you think is best? Stay around and wait for us to be finished?
You could. Time's a factor, though. It could be a while.
It could be all day. You might not have enough time.
Sometimes those conversations take a while.
What about crawling down low underneath the conversation?
Well, you really think doing an army crawl underneath us is the most respectful choice?
No, it is actually a bit rude and distracting as well. I think that might be the worst option.
You're not as sneaky as you might think you are.
Oh, I have an idea. What if there's another route we could take around the conversation?
Okay. That might take me an extra 5 minutes, but maybe that saves me from having to interrupt.
That might be a good option, but I don't think so. The best thing to do is just walk right on through. It won't bother us. It won't interrupt our conversation. Just go ahead.
Right. If I'm signing, I can already see you coming up in my peripheral vision. Just go ahead and walk by. You don't need my permission or a personal invitation to pass by. That's so much more distraction. That's so much more distracting. Just walk right through and go about your business. It's perfectly fine.
You may feel as a hearing person it's rude to walk through a signed conversation, but in our culture it's very appropriate. The other options that are listed on the board are more distracting and considered a bit more rude. Just walk right on through. So we hope you learned something new today, which is that you have the right to walk right on through the conversation that you see signed. Again, crawling down on the floor, asking permission, interrupting the conversation. These are all more distracting than just coming on through.
Yeah, I have seen the deer in headlights look from a lot of hearing people in this situation. Don't panic. Just go right by. It's not a big deal.
Some deaf people do as well get this deer in the headlights look. So on this slide, I won't name every single actor's name, but I did want to show you this extensive list of amazing, deaf, talented folks who appear on TV and movies and in social media, as well as in performances on stage. There are many more deaf actors now than ever before because the barriers to entry into Hollywood were so great that they did not allow deaf people to work in their business. They would cast different people in these roles. However, we've seen in recent times that deaf people are finally being casted into deaf roles.
There has been a tendency in Hollywood to cast hearing people in deaf roles. Not for the lack of talented deaf actors who are actually sign users, but that is changing more recently. Deaf people are playing deaf characters more often these days. We've got some more examples on the next slide, but A Quiet Place features a protagonist who's a deaf girl in a world where making noise is dangerous. The Marvel TV show Echo casts a deaf woman who's also Indigenous. Even better. Alakwa Cox is a deaf Indigenous woman in that lead role.
It can be quite bothersome when we see a hearing person cast as a deaf role in movies or TV. It's not appropriate, and often it's quite offensive to deaf people and the deaf community. In the deaf community, we have filed complaints and told Hollywood producers and casting directors that they should be casting deaf folks in these roles. So you can see there are quite a few actors and actresses on screen and stage. Hey, which of these ears do you think is deaf?
Ooh, which one's the deaf one?
Maybe the third one from the right? I see a hearing aid.
Okay, yeah, the second one. I see a hearing aid.
Yeah, it makes it a bit obvious with the hearing aid.
Right, assisted listening device.
Yeah, must be deaf.
Let's see, maybe the first and the second row. There's another hearing device. Yeah, maybe 5 or 6 of these.
Well, the answer is all.
They all are deaf.
All deaf.
Special thanks to all our coworkers for lending us their ears, even if they don't work.
We went around and asked our coworkers if we could, take a picture of their ear, and they were curious as to what we were using it for, and so we had to share with them that the point of it was to show that deaf ears cannot be identified. being deaf is an invisible thing. You can't tell if you're deaf or hearing. I mean, I guess if you're wearing a hearing aid, potentially, but if you don't wear an external auditory device, then you may never know. You couldn't tell how many ears in total there were that were deaf. They all look different, and so you wouldn't know that someone was deaf unless you tried to communicate with them, and then they gestured to write on a piece of paper. Or maybe they started signing at you, and so you don't notice that someone is deaf until you go to interact with them, typically.
Yes. You don't know until you meet that person.
Our next slide is regarding disrespectful and respectful language. In the deaf community, we typically use capital D deaf to signify a deaf person that is a part of deaf culture and uses ASL, typically for communication. They're involved in the community, and so on. Lowercase d deaf refers to someone who may or may not be part of the community, but they are deaf. And deaf is an umbrella term, as we discussed before, that covers most everyone who has hearing that is not within normal limits. And so we have these two columns listed out for you with respectful and disrespectful terms to refer to a person that you may be meeting with. So, hearing impaired, why is it not considered polite to use hearing impaired?
Well, your ears don't work. You must be impaired, right? What's wrong with that?
It can be offensive to deaf folks. If you maybe learned that hearing impaired was the politically correct term when you were growing up, the community has developed a dislike of this term because, again, they're identifying themselves as deaf and they are proud to be deaf. They don't hold an affinity with the word hearing impaired. Maybe still a few people will self-identify as hearing impaired or deaf mute. Deaf and dumb is out of the lexicon completely. And deaf disabled has a mixed opinion in our community. It's typically not used unless someone, again, self-identifies as deaf disabled. On the right-hand side, again, we have deaf with uppercase and lowercase. Then we have hard of hearing, late deafened, deafblind, and deaf disabled. Late deafened is referring to someone who was hearing, born hearing, acquired spoken language in that window of language acquisition from the age of 0 to 5. And then later in their life, it could have been overnight or a gradual decline in their hearing could have occurred. So their experience as a deaf person would not be similar to what I've experienced as a deaf person. They may not choose to learn ASL. They may choose to not involve themselves within deaf culture and the deaf community.
Often that person who becomes deaf later in life, sometimes that process happens relatively quickly. So you can speak clearly and people assume you can hear, which can lead to some confusion.
Right. This identity and this journey of living as a late deafened person does come with different challenges.
I actually wanted to mention something about the term deaf mute. This is a term you might come across in older medical texts about mental health. I've seen it as recently as 10 years ago when flipping through psychology textbooks or psychiatric evaluation texts. Again, it reveals a medicalized approach to deafness. Deaf mute is an archaic term for what we just now call a capital or lowercase d deaf person.
Additionally, I can share that the media does twist words. Often I'm asked to do interviews with a newspaper or TV news. And during one interview, I went along answering questions using the word deaf. I always use the word deaf, never deafness, never anything else. I emphasize the use of the word deaf to the interpreter as well to ensure that they are using the correct language and identifying me in the way that I choose to label myself. After I did an interview, one time I opened the newspaper to read said interview, and I read that I called myself hearing impaired, and deaf had been changed to hearing impaired all throughout the interview. So I contacted the interpreter and I ensured that they used the correct term. I said, "You said deaf, correct?" Once they told me that they said everything how I chose to say it, I went on to contact the editor of the paper and realized that they had changed it to hearing impaired because it would meet their readership, their audience better. I thought it was a bit of an egotistical decision, and I filed a complaint with the paper, but I used this moment and this instance to educate and spread awareness and hope that we stop using hearing impaired to refer to deaf people.
Right. If you're not sure, what do you do?
Just ask.
Right. Any cultural curiosity you have about race, religion, it's best to just ask how that person wants to be identified.
In those moments of hesitation, the best thing to do is ask. We can go on to the next slide. Again, we have these terms separated here, but I want everyone to understand that there is overlap between deaf culture, deaf family, deaf schools. There are audiological differences potentially. Hard of hearing folks may use some of their residual hearing, but again, they might have a deaf heart. So there are significant overlaps in these areas of being deaf or hard of hearing. They have differences in access preferences or requirements as well sometimes. Would you like to expand more, Kevin?
I think you've got it. I guess I will say it is important to recognize deaf or hard of hearing, late deafened, deaf-blind. Each of these identities have their own aspects, and they require their own necessary accommodations. They have different communication preferences. I mentioned before, deafness can happen later in life, late deafened, and that can be gradual or sudden. Right? Sometimes that person learns ASL, sometimes they don't. They might speak for themselves and get by with assistive listening technologies. That's just their journey. They may choose to learn sign language or not, and each person is unique. My wife was late deafened. She started to lose her hearing in her teens, but she only started learning ASL in her 20s. She chose that route, and she kind of has the benefit of both now. She speaks clearly, and she can sign fluently. People often misunderstand that because she can speak, she must be able to hear, But that was her experience. She chose the path that was laid out for her. She decided to learn sign language. So both of those experiences are true for late deafened people. Of course, the preferred accommodations can vary depending on who you are. Some use an assistive listening device or an FM system. They might use a wearable microphone that can send audio to a hearing aid. Some depend on closed captions or automatic speech recognition technology. If they haven't learned sign language, they might rely on that kind of thing. ASL and oral interpreters are less common now. That's a person who will speak clearly so that a deaf person can lip read what's being said in the room. That's for folks who don't usually know sign language, and it doesn't work for everyone. To communicate on the phone, there's a technology called voice carryover, or VCO. This is for a deaf person who really wants to use their own voice on the phone while still watching a video relay interpreter, or reading captioning for what is being said back to them. It makes that person feel like they have more control than working through a third-party interpreter.
Right, deaf-blind.
You'll notice the words deaf and blind are combined here. The term in the community is deaf-blind. This is typically a deaf person who may lose their vision progressively later on. Often that's because of Usher's syndrome or another type of vision loss, like central vision loss. Each deafblind person has their own story. Some folks don't think they have a vision problem, but then they have a lot of bruises on their legs from walking into things. It's not a one-size-fits-all, just like any of these other categories. Again, each individual deafblind person's journey is always unique. Often, deafblind people use sign language themselves, but they don't have the vision to perceive sign language when someone signs back to them. They have to find another way to communicate. What deafblind people often use is tactile sign language. Pro-tactile interpreting is a newer technique that helps give deafblind people the context of what's happening in the space around them, even though they can't perceive it directly.
Some deafblind people prefer to sit close to the person they're conversing with to fit into their range of vision, the person's signs and facial expressions. Pro-tactile looks like this, where I would be signing while the other person is perceiving those signs through touch, through touching the top of my hand. Different communication varies depending on the person's preference.
Deafblind people often need an interpreter to wear clothing that contrasts with their skin tone to be as visible as possible. If you have a lighter skin tone, wear dark clothing. Darker skin tone wears lighter clothing. They might also use a large print accommodation or inverted color text technology. Just like you would provide a Spanish translation for someone who might need it, they use a large text conversion of that same written material. So keep in mind, just because that person's deafblind doesn't mean that you can predict their needs.
Often the system fails to recognize other needs for bolder text, large print materials. It's a process that's often forgotten and lost in the work of the system daily. If you can send forms out from your office using large print, please do so.
Right. Technology is getting better every day, so deafblind people have much more access to that visual information. You might have come across image descriptions. Those can be translated by a Braille reader, which gives more information about what's on screen. So maybe you'll see that on social media.
An example that we can give is if there's a deaf person in a residential treatment facility, you have to be mindful of audio and visual modes of communication to make sure that the information is presented in a way that the person can access. So, how should hearing people interact with deaf folks? Always face the person. That's a good way to start. And speak normally. Again, everyone has their own preferences, but as long as you're speaking normally and don't exaggerate your face or your lips, also don't shout because we are deaf and shouting will not help the conversation go more smoothly. If you're noticing a communication breakdown, please rephrase your sentence. If you are asked to repeat, consider using different words to better describe what you're talking about. Use pantomime and gestures, and also be aware of the pitfalls of lip reading and writing back and forth. The best thing to do is to not assume and just ask.
You might think these things are strange, but it happens all the time. I'll be out with my family and I'll be interacting with a salesperson, some kind of store clerk, and it's only later that my hearing kids will tell me that that clerk was shouting at me. I'm completely deaf. I was oblivious to it, but it means that whatever I thought was being said just to me was being overheard by everyone else in the store. So please be considerate when communicating private information in a public space. There are other ways to share information, and talking to a deaf person doesn't mean you should speak any louder. That usually is not the best choice.
Today, deaf people are using devices like our phones, using technology to text back and forth or use speech to text to communicate clearly.
Right. There have been initiatives to try to make a sign to English text automatic recognition technology, but ASL is just too complex. It's not only what's signed, it's the facial expression, it's body positioning, it's the speed and clarity of the signer, right? It's interesting to imagine, but I don't think that kind of technology will be ever totally accurate. All right, let's move on.
Sure. Next, we have another pop quiz. The question is, to get the attention of a deaf person who's looking away, what should you do? Hey, how would you call someone?
Oh, hey, you tapped me on my arm.
Just like that, a quick tap on the shoulder, not a wave in the face in their personal space.
That's not it.
That can be seen as maybe aggressive. Again, yelling, shouting. We're deaf. We're not going to get the attention of a deaf person by shouting. And again, the tap should be in a neutral space. On the shoulder is preferable, never on the top of the head. We don't want to patronize folks.
Deaf people may throw something across the room to get attention. Something soft, not a rock or a pen, but this is an in-group behavior. I don't think it's appropriate for hearing people to throw stuff at us to get our attention. They should instead tap on the arm or shoulder or flash the lights.
In deaf households, this is very typical. For example, if dinner was ready, my mother would get our attention by flickering the lights in the basement to call us up to the dining room for food. And we knew when we saw those lights flickering, it was dinner time. There are other ways that we call attention. If someone's sitting at the table, we can, vibrate the table, move it a little bit to make sure that we get their attention, or maybe stomp on the floor.
Yeah, as a kid, my dad would pound on the floor in our one-story house to get my attention. I was, down the hall in my bedroom. I could feel that vibration, and I knew he wanted me to go over to him. So even though he wasn't thrilled that I learned ASL later in life, technically he was using a deaf culture technique all along.
Some people might be scared by a quick tap on the shoulder if they're not expecting it, of course. You can quickly explain, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Some hearing people are not used to being touched, so they may also be a bit more jumpy when a deaf person does try to get their attention in a way that conforms with the deaf cultural norms. So here we have lip reading. As you can see, the first bullet says that 70% of spoken language is not visible on the lips. So if you're assuming that a deaf person is an expert in lip reading, they really are not. They're only catching about 30% of what you're saying, meaning they're only understanding a portion of that. There's a lot missing from a conversation if you're only getting 30%. This can lead to miscommunication, misunderstandings, and misinterpretations of what you're trying to convey.
This was difficult when everyone was masked a few years ago. Lip reading just became completely impossible. Again, the reason deaf people are asked to lip read is because the hearing person doesn't know sign language. When you ask that question, you're effectively putting the burden of communication on the deaf person. You're not actually meeting them halfway. You're expecting them to make accommodation for you. I consider myself a skilled lip reader, but even I don't catch everything, and misunderstandings are unavoidable. Whether it's a nurse or a salesperson asking, hey, can you lip read? Right? It becomes a deaf person's problem. It's a burden when we were there for a different reason.
Yeah, taking up some of that communication burden would help us.
Right. What I came in for was medical attention or treatment. And now I'm doubly burdened. I don't feel well. I'm being asked to read the lips of the doctor or nurse to get care. Maybe I don't catch everything and I have to guess at important details about treatment. Maybe I'm under the influence of a medication, and you can imagine the difficulty.
Traumatizing experiences can also influence the abilities of someone to lip read. Whenever someone asks me if I can lip read, I always respond no, and I go to texting back and forth because that is clear, texting or writing. I always answer no, I cannot lip read.
Yeah, I might say I'll try my best, but that's my choice, and it doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes I do say no, depending on the situation. Because of the way I grew up, it might be easier for me than for someone else, but I understand Susan's reasoning. She doesn't want to have to struggle through it, so she just says no. And what works for everyone is a little different.
Of course, it depends, and no one person is the same as the next. We all approach situations differently. I say no because if I say yes, I know that they will start speaking a mile a minute and I will miss more than 30%. I don't want to cause more misunderstandings, and I would just rather get to the point of writing back and forth or texting back and forth to get a grasp of what they are trying to communicate. We also use close skills. For example, at restaurants, the waiter comes over and asks, "What? Do you know what you want to drink?" We are expecting these questions because that is the typical interaction. It's the first thing that the waiter says every single time I sit down at a restaurant. Or if we get pulled over for speeding, what do they ask for?
License and registration, please.
Exactly. We have closure skills and we know what to expect in these social situations. Do I understand what is being said by lip reading? No, I'm using my closure skills to predict these expected questions and respond appropriately. Again, showing the license, showing the registration, ordering my drink.
I will say the self-checkout has been an amazing gift to deaf people. I don't have to interact with the cashier if I don't have to. I might be able to use closure skills. They're usually asking, do you need help? Did you find everything you need? But if they ask me something else, then we're in a bind. So I can just use the self-checkout myself, and I can avoid that potential stressful situation. I just scan my items, nod thank you to someone, and I can leave the store. Unless there's an error with the machine, I might have to interact with the store clerk, but... Oh, and don't steal. I know there's some folks that steal out there, but you make it harder for us if they take away this technology.
Right. There would be no more self-checkout if they take this away to punish those who are acting poorly. It would hurt deaf people and our ability to get through the self-checkout. I do want to point out here at the bottom of the slide, we have common words that look similar on the lips: pale, bale, male, and mall. And so a deaf person trying to lip read these words would have to play a guessing game of which one was said because they do look so similar. Next up, we have a deaf cartoonist by the name of Matt Daigle, and it's depicting more lip-reading nightmares. Trying to lip-read a hearing person that you're not familiar with and trying to catch the information that's spoken through various mouths, you can see how that would be difficult. Some people are easier, quote unquote, to lip read, and some people are more difficult to lip read if they have a large mustache or if they're smoking, or, Santa Claus would be very difficult to lip read.
Yeah, big beard on that guy.
That beard would cause so much misunderstanding.
Yeah, I would just have to nod along and hope with my closure skills I know what's going on. How are you doing today? I can get by, but anything more complicated and I'm lost.
What's really cool is there are more signing Santas nowadays, providing more access. But of course, if you're interacting with someone, you always want to be mindful of these pitfalls of lip reading so you can avoid them. A reminder that ASL is not a spoken language. It's not a written language either. It is a visual language. We do not have a written form of our language. ASL and English do not have similar grammar structure or syntax. Many deaf people use ASL as their first language and English as their second language, depending on their background. There are cases where there's severe language deprivation or limited literacy skills in the community that we've observed. Some deaf people have the reading level of maybe a third grader up to reading at a PhD level. There are such varied literacy skills in our community. And on average, in the research, my belief was that deaf people are reading at what level?
Third or fourth grade.
Yeah, third or fourth grade reading levels. So you can see on average, the literacy level in the community has been a struggle.
Part 2 of our presentation today, we'll get into more detail about the deeper impacts of substance use disorder on the deaf community. But we're just doing some table setting here today. And I actually can recall being a graduate student in Minnesota. I was working on my degree, and part of that was clinical supervision. I was working in a hospital, and they had no understanding of deaf culture. The supervisors of the programs I was a part of just had never interacted with a deaf person. So I had an interpreter to work with my clinician. And one day we got done with a meeting with the clinical supervisor, and the interpreter told me that this person had asked if I could read. I was shocked. I had a graduate degree. I was a little astounded that they were asking about my literacy. I'm certainly smart enough to be working on a graduate degree, right? I'm working in a clinical setting. This is somebody who seems brilliant, who has a medical knowledge, right? But they have this misconception that I couldn't read. It was tough. It was a real gut punch. There are still folks out there like that.
Similarly, in counseling offices or in other centers, there are self-help lines or hotlines for support. This could be a domestic violence hotline, a suicide hotline. For these hotlines, it's important to have a text line so that deaf folks can text in, while the operators on the other end have to be mindful that deaf people texting in may have limited English skills. So when you're texting, there may be understandings if you are working in that field. I used to work in a field where people would show me the messages that they got from self-help text lines so that I would be able to interpret the English for them. It's successful for some, but not acceptable for others who have limited literacy skills. And again, as we said, keeping the language use more simple and not using terms that may be above someone's literacy skills if they are reading at a third or fourth grade level.
Simple doesn't mean dumbed down or at an elementary level. The simple things, the questions. Do you need to use a restroom? Do you need to have a meal? right? Anything more complex, like a therapy session, you just can't write back and forth that complex language. This one's pretty self-explanatory, again, from the same deaf artist, that deaf guy, Matt and Kay Daigle. Here they're talking about the differences between English and ASL, which is perfect for our purposes. So these children are communicating in sign language. One asks the other, how is ASL different from English? And in the second panel, right, they're explaining in English, a dragon is dragon, a sequence of 6 letters. The third panel, has a full dragon made of Play-Doh. And this child is saying that's what sign language is. It is the visual representation.
It's descriptive.
Yes, sign language describes something, gives you something to look at.
Exactly. We can look at the pointy ears, the bulging eyes, the scaly limbs, arms and wings and claws and snaggled teeth. We can show all of this in ASL. And it's not just a simple word, dragon. We're bringing it to life with our hands. And you may not know what a dragon looks like if you read that word in English, but in ASL, you will know exactly what a dragon looks like.
Using facial expression, body language, other concepts, you can show the intensity of the heat from the fire-breathing dragon, the movement of their tongue or their tail, it's a very visual language.
As well as how deaf people explain things in deaf culture. For example, how we tell stories. Typically, deaf folks will give you a lot of details to a potentially simple question. They'll start with something that happened 10 years ago and explain the causes and effects that led them to today. They'll go on at length with a story in full detail of everything that's happened over the past maybe 10 years. They'll elaborate on background information, and you may be expecting a shorter story, but deaf people tend to give you more detail than you might be expecting.
Part of the work I do is as a deaf interpreter, which I'll explain more in part 2. But sometimes I'm working in the hospital and a doctor will ask a deaf patient how they got that foot injury. Their story will start 2 weeks ago. They almost twisted their ankle and luckily they didn't. When really what the doctor needs to know is about how they injured their foot that morning, right? It's as simple as, I twisted it, right? But sometimes we have to cue those deaf people to truncate that story. I don't necessarily need that background information. It's not helpful to a diagnosis. So interpreters will sometimes do that, deaf or hearing.
We remain patient.
We have to. There's a lot of unnecessary narration.
If you cut them off or interrupt them, that will disrupt their connection, their relationship with said medical professional. But if you allow them the time and respect to listen to their entire story of the entire day where they hurt their foot, they will eventually reach the pertinent information that you're looking for.
Next up is a heavy topic, but it's something that deaf people deal with every day. Now we're talking about autism. As coined by Tom Humphreys in the late 70s, the notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear or behave in the manner of one who hears. Essentially the belief that people who can hear are superior to those who cannot. It's a big topic of discussion in the deaf community because we face this type of oppression every day. both in and out of the workplace, we're often deprived of access. Our interpreters are canceled, and there aren't other accommodations made to make sure that we have access to our daily lives.
Here you can see in the image, this is a photo that was taken a while ago at a school for the deaf. These children are standing in freezing cold water in a pool. They're being forced to practice speech until they produce the perfect sound, and once they pass the test, they are rewarded with a hot shower. As you can see, the boy in the back is being rewarded with a hot shower, while the other boys are still in the pool being punished with cold water. It's a tactic of abuse and public shaming and public humiliation. This was a tactic that was used to force assimilation on these children to ensure that they could produce speech in a way that was thought to be acceptable. If they did it incorrectly, they would stay in the pool for a longer time, and many of these children were traumatized from this experience. This can lead to generational traumas still felt throughout our community when hearing people are forcing speech upon deaf people. It's gotten better in the past few decades, but this is a heavy reality of what deaf people live through. Again, this generalized belief that being hearing is better than being deaf, that was the root of autism, and this was exacerbated by Alexander Graham Bell. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, he invented the telephone.
Of course, everyone knows Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and people love him for his wonderful invention. The telephone was the best thing ever to the hearing community. But here in the deaf community, we have issues with Alexander Graham Bell. And the reason is because he was against the use of sign language. He spoke out about it on several occasions. To anyone who would listen, he touted the use of the oral method, the spoken method, as a way to educate deaf people, as a way to force assimilation on deaf people. The oral method is a medical view of deafness, forcing deaf people to speak and forcing assimilation amongst them. He expressed his beliefs through published papers that deaf people should not be allowed to marry each other. He was practicing eugenics, and he was promoting eugenics. So many people don't know this, but this is the dark side of Alexander Graham Bell's work. He invented the phone, yes, but he also did some very harmful things to the deaf community and harmed us in ways that were ugly. And ironically, Alexander Graham Bell did not know the statistics on deaf people being born to hearing parents. As I mentioned earlier, 90% of deaf people have hearing parents. Alexander Graham Bell thought he was trying to reduce the number of deaf people in the world by not allowing deaf people to marry each other, but that did not change the number of deaf people in the world. Obviously, there are still deaf people here today. His philosophy was erroneous, and deaf people marrying deaf people did not contribute to a greater deaf population like he believed it would. Autism is also apparent during the Holocaust. There were forced involuntary sterilizations of deaf people. But again, we know that these forced sterilizations of deaf folks to eradicate deaf babies being born is, again, an erroneous path to reduce the deaf population. This is a form of eugenics that was practiced and oppressive towards deaf people back in that time. Some people didn't know that they couldn't have children until after. Sign language was not allowed to be used in schools, but deaf children would figure out ways to communicate in secret away from their hearing teacher's eyes. They would sign under desks and in corners, out of sight. If they were caught, of course, they were punished. But we've seen changes in deaf education where there are now more deaf teachers and more deaf principals of these schools, and sign language is now allowed as a form of communication and a form of education.
Yeah, even though these students were being physically punished for using sign language, they always found ways to use it out of view. They were so desperate for any kind of connection with their peers. It was worth the risk. They found a way, even if they had to hide it.
See, the ICED conference did not win. They tried to eradicate sign language, but it's survived to this day. It's put up a fight.
And you see it everywhere. It's ASL's on TV and movies. Students take college ASL language courses. I think we have to thank Marlee Matlin for her Oscar-winning performance in 1986, Children of a Lesser God. After that movie came out, the enrollment in ASL courses had a huge surge in popularity. We saw a similar spike that followed the release of the movie Coda that came out a few years ago. Students are more interested in learning this language. I think keeping them committed to fluency is the challenge.
Autism can be a very subtle form of exclusion. If I wanted to apply for a job or volunteer myself for a board or a project, autism can be used in subtle ways to exclude people because the other project members don't want to work with a deaf person. They come up with various reasons to hide their beliefs that the deaf person cannot do the job. And it can be difficult to prove that discrimination and autism is occurring. Another example is captioning on movies. Some production companies won't caption their movies. Even still today, it's a challenge with the addition of Instagram and YouTube. Some of those captions are auto captions and are oftentimes incorrect. The spelling is wrong, and the automated systems of captioning are not 100% accessible. We have to go through different accommodation methods to try to figure out what is being said, and we're still not getting the full information on the level that our hearing counterparts are.
With the rise of social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, I see a lot more hearing creators working hard to add subtitles to their content. Obviously not everyone does, but I appreciate seeing those. If a video doesn't have subtitles, I'll skip it, so I often see videos that do.
We always appreciate access points when they are available to us. Sometimes hearing people can disrespect the deaf person in the room when they're choosing to speak with the interpreter directly instead of the deaf person. It's not okay to do so, and you should be speaking to the deaf client that's in the room. Especially if the question is related to where to take ASL classes. That's a question that should be directed to the deaf person. Another form of autism is denying a qualified deaf person from a job opportunity. We are still experiencing businesses asking the deaf person to bring a family member or a friend to interpret for them, but it is the responsibility of the business or the entity to follow the Americans with Disabilities Act and provide interpreting services for a deaf client or interviewee. Oh, and before we go ahead with this, I do want to talk about autism being discriminatory. It's in the same class of discrimination as other isms.
Absolutely. It parallels with a lot of other isms, a lot of groups that are oppressed by the majority.
Yeah, racism, classism, sexism, those are similar forms of discrimination of a person. These are comments that deaf people see all the time.
You've probably seen closed captioning on a TV. Maybe in a loud space, you see that text scroll across a screen. Closed captions wasn't even an option until 1980. So, as a child, I just had to make up the dialogue in my head. I remember watching action movies like The Lone Ranger or The $6 Million Man before captions were available. And I just had to make it up on my own. When I asked what they were saying, my folks would tell me, it's not anything important. Nowadays, a household has 5 or 6 TVs, but back then we just had the one, and my dad liked watching the news. You can imagine how bored I was watching the news without captions as a kid. There wasn't even a recognition at that time that I was being left out. Then in the 80s, I remember we were all so excited to talk about the latest episode of our favorite TV show, shows like Dallas or Destiny. Before the 1980s, I didn't have access to anything but the visuals.
Often, deaf people will experience being told, never mind, when they ask what was just said, or I'll tell you later. That's a common one, and then they never tell us later. Often people will say, oh, you look like a deaf person. I don't really know what a deaf person looks like, do you?
You speak so well for a deaf person, and so on.
Can you lip read? Yeah, that's a common one. And still, to this day, people will ask, can you drive when you're deaf? That one bothers me.
How do deaf people communicate in bed if they're in the dark? People can't guess for themselves. I just turn on my bedside lamp and have that conversation. Or I practice my tactile ASL skills. Neither me or my wife are deafblind, but if it works, it works.
When at work with colleagues or patients or any coworker or staff in the area that is deaf, be mindful of saying, I'll tell you later, or never mind. These can be very exclusionary comments. We'll move on to the next slide. And the first point is to recognize your privilege. As an ally, we can provide support, and when we're, let's say, seeing that a patient is watching a TV with no captioning, an ally would go request for captioning to be turned on or turn it on themselves instead of putting the burden on the deaf person to go ask for some sort of accommodation.
A good ally will help advocate for an interpreter if there isn't one. Even one more person agitating for improved accessibility can help that deaf person just feel a bit more included and less dismissed. Maybe it was a last-minute request, so a good ally could propose that the meeting be postponed or do other things just to ease that burden, to share the responsibility for effective communication and make us feel just a bit more included.
Sometimes people can invite them into our lives a bit too much. I can give you an example to explain what I mean. I was sitting in a doctor's office after I had told the front desk staff that I was there ready for my appointment, and I see a woman approaching me. I thought maybe they were the interpreter, but after asking them a few questions and trying to communicate, I realized they were not the interpreter, but they were someone who knew a little bit of sign, and again, I emphasize a little bit of sign, that was told to come ask me some sort of questions. The other staff knew that she knew sign language, so they sent her over to ask me a few questions or to lead me into a certain area, but I felt that this was an overstepping of the privilege that she had as a hearing person who knew a little bit of sign. She was involved in my personal private business that she did not need to be involved in. So as an ally, know your privilege and know how to appropriately approach people with cultural respect and cultural humility. Don't make the interaction more awkward than it needs to be. If you can write back and forth and text with me, that's much more preferred than involving a third person into this interaction to quote unquote help. I felt that this action crossed the line and it was not supportive and it was not the action of an ally. Other times it can make the situation more awkward than it needs to be. So an ally recognizes their own privilege and takes responsibility for changing these societal patterns. So on this slide, we're pointing out that it can be a challenge for deaf people in counseling centers or therapy facilities. The community is very small. The deaf community specifically is very small. And someone who moved from California to New York State may have ties to people who already live here or people back in California that know the people they're meeting here. So we have a lot of mutual friends, a lot of connections. Maybe we know each other from college or other areas of our personal life. And if you don't know the person you're standing in front of, you'll know their cousin or their friend for sure.
Often that comes from a shared education at Gallaudet or NTID, or just a shared childhood. It's a really close-knit community. It's almost impossible not to have a mutual acquaintance with another deaf person.
It can be challenging to have a fresh start. If you're moving to a different state, you still may be in contact with mutual friends or others who know you. And so this may be a barrier for people who are seeking out counseling services or interventions because the community is so tightly knit. And so that is something that us folks in the deaf community do deal with.
I have multiple roles in the deaf community. I'm not only a counselor, I've done therapy in the past, and I'm also a deaf interpreter. So anytime I go to a deaf event, I need my deaf community fix, the chances are pretty high that I'll bump into someone I've worked with before. Of course, in my professional capacity, I explain to them that I won't be the one to initiate an interaction outside of the medical setting, but if they want to say hello to me, then that's appropriate. When I'm in such a sensitive and visible role in the community, I have to be really cautious about how I behave in those social settings. So I have to manage both of those roles. I'm also a deaf interpreter. So I don't interact with the people I meet as patients in the hospital. I keep a polite boundary the way any other interpreter would, and I just behave as if we've never met. Communicating with family can be a challenge in the deaf community. My wife and I are the only deaf people in our family. My side of the family lives out of state, and so it means which means during Thanksgiving or the holidays, we get left out. We're pretty used to just entertaining ourselves by now. We have our own conversation at the dinner table because no one else uses sign language. We're pretty used to it. Instead, we have more of a Friendsgiving tradition a few days before Thanksgiving. We invite our community members and we can all socialize with our friends in the deaf community. We can have our lively conversation all in sign language.
The next point here talks about confidentiality in the deaf community and privacy in the deaf community. This is very important for us, again, because of our tight-knit community. I'd like to give everyone a few moments just to take a look over this piece of art and tell me, what do you see? I can tell you that the artist's name is Susan Duport. what can you interpret about this picture?
I've seen this one before.
It's a pretty powerful image. Yeah, any thoughts?
This happens all too often. Deaf person is treated like the lapdog of a family. Someone who's nice to have around but doesn't need to be attended to. You know, whether that's because they're deaf or deaf and disabled, that does happen.
If you can see the folks seated above the yellow table, you can see their blue faces that are blurred. Their arms are crossed as if they won't sign, as if they're refusing to sign. They're also painted blue. That might elucidate feelings of coldness from the family members. And then this young child is sitting down in front of the family as if she was a dog. She has her tongue out and she's lower to the floor, kind of like your example, you know, the family dog, that's where they lay, that's their spot. She's physically lower in this image, and she's separated from the people sitting on the couch by something that looks like a fence. It's a coffee table, but it looks like a fence. And this gives us that feeling that her interactions with her family are probably just a simple pat on the head and a thumbs up. This is a common experience for many deaf people in hearing families. They feel left out. They have lack of communication with their family. They're language deprived. Typically, hearing families don't sign with their deaf child or deaf family member, leaving them to feel lonely. And unfortunately, that is the experience of 90% of deaf people.
I think all of us in the deaf community have come across these stories before, and it's something I experienced myself. With that, we're going to wrap up part 1 with a video. It can be meaningful for people who don't realize the complexity and challenge of lip reading. So we're going to ask you to watch this and consider how difficult it can be to read lips and what it means when you're asking the deaf person, can you read lips? We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
So when I was really young, probably kindergarten or first grade, I have a much older brother, and we'd go out to recess, and there was this older guy, he might have been in like 5th or 6th grade, that always used to pick on us, and I didn't really know what to do about it, and I definitely looked up and completely trusted what my grandmother
Today we went to a high school and I pet and shows of many different animals.
I was posing for a picture with all of my girlfriends when all of a sudden one of them reached over.
Can you read my lips?
Can you read
My lips.
Can you read?
Can you read my lips? Can you read her lips?
Oh my God, Clementine loves bread. She stole a loaf off the counter.
Can you read his lips?
I have 2 dogs. One boxer, she's 7.5, and one mixed breed who's 8.
I am deaf, but my word. What the is a hearing one? I rely on the visual, not the auditory. The word lip reading implies reading, like reading a book
whose text is legible and clear.
But the human face isn't a book, and lip reading isn't reading. People mumble, people talk fast and laugh loudly, people have facial hair like porcupines, lips like sphincters, people cover their mouths, people have accents. But real conversations don't take place in the studio.
Growing up, I used to...
I'm putting together another episode without all the pieces. I look in on your mouth. I tried to grasp with one sense information intended for another. There have been times when I've questioned why I even tried to read the way through the swamp, when I could just use sign language. Some deaf people choose to do just that. It's like a different world. A world filled with rich expression and culture. When people sound, they come alive. But I know I want both worlds. Communication is never a given.
Tuesday, I woke up, had a
And
rash.
she just pulled my dress down and
When I was little, my family
was
got a
out.
cat.
Like, why don't you
Wednesday
just
morning.
hit him in the
I
face?
held a
That was like the
snake,
last thing that I ever
guinea
would do.
pig.
Last winter, I learned
and
to
two different kinds of
I only cried twice.
But when the reading works, when I focus on one nurturing face and launch into a conversation, something clicks. Right then, I feel something extraordinary.
Implies
Human
reading connection.
Connection.
I want to thank Susan and Kevin for joining me today. I hope you all find it useful while assisting clients in need of services. Your feedback is important to us. It helps us to know if we are meeting your educational goals and expectations. Once you have viewed the two-part presentation in its entirety and completed the quiz, if prompted, please follow directions to access the SurveyMonkey website and take a moment to complete the evaluation, including suggesting any future topics for Learning Thursdays. Once again, thank you for joining us and keep up the good work.